Hello. In this video, we're going to start looking at the vertical line test. The vertical line test is used to determine functions when you have a graph. So a relation is a function if for every possible vertical line that you can draw, it only crosses the graph at most once. Okay. We want to determine if the following are functions, and then give the domain and range in interval notation. So I'm just going to show whether yes, they're functions or no, they're not functions to begin with. So this first bit will just be determining if they're functions. We have 4 different graphs here. So for the first one, notice that if I draw a vertical line, none of these vertical lines are going to cross more than once at all. So the answer is yes, this one is a function. Looking at letter B, notice that there exists at least one vertical line that I can draw here where it's crossing 2 different times. It only takes a single time where that happens, so that means that for letter B, no, this is not a function. For letter C, the same thing is going to happen, where it's crossing more than once for at least one of the vertical lines that you draw. Therefore, this is not a function. And then for letter D, notice that for any vertical line I draw, it'll only cross at most once. So therefore, yes, this is in fact a function. So the vertical line test is really not that tough. It's really pretty easy, to be honest with you. But you have to know how to use it. Now, I do want to make one indication here. Sometimes people start looking at the edges of graphs and thinking, maybe that's starting to, be vertical. I'll be honest with you, it's going to be very obvious whether or not it's going to be, if it's not going to be a function. In other words, if you have something like this, that's obvious that that is not a function. Same thing for this circle. For this parabola, it may not become obvious, especially if I continue going like this. It would look almost vertical over here. But, we're not going to do that to you. So it'll be very clear whether or not, it'll be very clear if it's not a function using the vertical line test. Excellent. The next thing we want to do is start looking at the domain. Now, the domain is going to be the x values. So if you look at A here, we want to look at all the possible x values, but notice that this is a curve. With curves, we have an infinite number of points. That's actually what the definition of a curve is. It's every point that lies on a particular equation. So we want to make sure that we include all of that, which means we must use interval notation. Notice that this arrow is pointing up and to the left, which means, for our sake, for the domain question, is that this is going forever to the left and it's going forever to the right, which means on the x-axis, there is no x that I would not use. In other words, I will use every x value on the x-axis. So the domain here will be negative infinity to infinity. Next, we'll look at the range. We'll look at each one of these individually here. So for the range will come from the y values. Notice, though, that there's actually a minimum y value here while we continue up forever for the y there. So for the range itself, the lowest it can ever be is going to be this one right here, whatever that happens to be. In this case, we're just going to assume that each one of these tick marks is 1. I didn't put it on the graph, but we're going to go ahead and assume that it's 1. So this coordinate here, the y value is 1, and it's going to keep going up forever. So for the range, it starts at 1 and goes up to infinity. Excellent. Now, for letter B, let's look at the domain and range, starting out with the domain. Domain, for this one, notice that this is a circle, so the domain and range will be limited. But the domain will be limited to between these 2 x values. Now, on the x-axis, that means 1, 2, 3, 4. That's -4 right there, going all the way to +2 right there. But notice that I can use any x value between those 2. So the domain here is going to be -4 to 2. As for the range, well, the lowest it can ever be is right here, and the highest it can ever be is right here. So on the y-axis, this low value here is 0. This high value here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the range here is going to be 0 to 6. Excellent. Now let's look at letter D here, letter C here. My apologies. Helps if I go in order, doesn't it? So for letter C, notice again for the x values, I can use any of these x values, and notice that we stop right here, but I can use any of those going towards the left. So the domain here starts at negative infinity, but it ends at this x value of 1, 2, 3. As for the range, notice that there's an arrow pointing up and to the left, and there's an arrow pointing down and to the left. In other words, this goes down forever, and it goes up forever, and everything in between. So the range here is going to be negative infinity to infinity. And now for letter D. Notice that again on the x-axis, this is pointing to the left and down, to the right and down over here, and I can use anything in between those. So for the x-axis, I can use anything to the left and anything to the right, which means I can use negative infinity to infinity for my domain. As for the range, notice that again it's going down forever, so I can use anything that way, but there is a maximum value right there. And that maximum value is 1, 2, 3. So the range here, it starts at negative infinity and goes up to 3. Excellent. Well, I believe that is it for this particular video. I'll go ahead and end it here, and I will see you in the next one. Have fun.